You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast series from the Conference Board, providing business leaders with trusted insights for what's ahead.
Hello and welcome to this episode of C-Suite Perspectives, a new podcast series by the Conference Board. These ongoing conversations will take an objective, data-driven look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business executives. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best, provide insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series, and joining us today is the leader of our Human Capital Center, Dr. Rebecca Ray. Rebecca, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Steve.
And in today's conversation, we're going to talk about a bunch of issues related to the workforce and the workplace, and especially how all of this has been impacted by the pandemic. And Rebecca, you are the world's expert on this whole range of subjects. You know, throughout the year, the world has changed, Rebecca, and you've written a lot and you've spoken a lot about this. But as you look back, what do you think are the biggest changes over the period of the pandemic? And, what do you think is going to be temporary and what's going to be permanent?
Sure. Well, Steve, I'm not sure I'm the world's expert, but I do have the benefit of working with a really smart team. We've been looking at this for months now. And, I think as things have unfolded, clearly no one expected this to last quite as long as it has. And I think there are some outcomes from the length of this. And let's talk about this as a sort of an aggregate with the confluence of a global pandemic, a global economic crisis, as well as a social unrest in many parts of the world, particularly in the United States. I do think that we have seen quite a bit that has radically changed and perhaps forever changed the workplace. I think when companies, first started to think about this, they thought this might be much more temporary than it was. And I think what's happened is you've seen the projected dates to reopen continually moving further back as the pandemic and other factors have sort of raged on. And, I'd love to share a little bit about some of the things that we found in this series of surveys of both employers and employees that we found particularly striking.
Right. And, you've talked to CHROs around the country. And of course, we have feedback around the world, which is pretty consistent. What are you hearing?
Well, sure. I think every company did some very serious, thoughtful things about how to safely reopen the workplace, if indeed they closed. And in the United States, about 13% never did. Many of them were related to essential, services. But for those who did close, there's a great deal of thought that was given to when do we bring back employees, which ones, in what way, and how, what's the timing, what are the safety protocols. And they really planned, I think, for a variety of not only safety protocols, but also equipment and really thoughtful ways in which they would re-engage the workforce. But knowing that the changes were ever coming and it was ever evolving, I don't think that they communicated as much as certainly the employees told us they would have liked. And that created anxiety. Employees told us that in the absence of information, there was real anxiety, not only about the return to the workplace, but also not knowing what all the protocols were, sort of fostered a lack of trust with colleagues, that these colleagues would be as diligent as they themselves knew they would be about following safety protocols. We looked at different types of workers, different levels of workers, and what we found even this January was that there's still a lot of discomfort among lower-ranking employees and women in particular. And say what you will, right or wrong, but given that most caretaking responsibilities still fall disproportionately to women, that gender disparity and comfort around returning to the workplace is understandable. And we're only now just sort of sorting out, childcare and elder care. And I think the rate of exposure, while lessened, people still feel that they bring it home. And I think companies need to do maybe a better job of stating exactly what the protocols will be, their plans for enforcing it, and making sure that it's indeed a safe place. That can go a long way to mitigating concerns.
Yeah, those are a lot of insights from your work. But I think at the common denominator, you've said it's really communication both ways, so that there isn't this mystery out there or this gap, which just drives people nuts, and in Zoom time, every hour in a Zoom meeting is like a day in the office. It just, the gap just echoes, and so there really needs to be consistent and frequent communication on all of these issues, right?
Absolutely. And, one of the surprising things we found is that fewer than we had hoped indicated that they were indeed surveying their employees to find out what their actual concerns were. And so many of the protocols or safety things or changes in HR policy that they thought would be important to do probably are, but they missed being able to respond to or plan for some of the things that employees said they really needed help with. They were concerned about childcare. They were concerned about safety in public transportation. They were concerned about, I don't mean to make this seem harsher than it is, but the ramifications for those who don't follow the protocols. Those would have gone a long way to helping people feel perhaps more comfortable about returning.
Yeah, and people would just relax if they, if they knew what everybody was thinking. It's always the case, though. Every other word now that you hear as it relates to return to the workplace is hybrid. What does the new hybrid environment mean?
Well, I think we're going to have a hybrid, digitally fueled workplace for a very long time. And I think hybrid really boils down to flexibility and choice. And I think it means that companies need to think about what really needs to happen in the workplace for people to, first of all, feel comfortable and be productive. Second of all, continue to build on the core values and the culture that an organization has. And what can we do to be flexible? Here's what I think has happened. So during this pandemic, where people have learned that remote working not only does not carry the same stigma that it might have in the past, we also have seen technology enable remote working. I mean, imagine if we didn't have Microsoft Teams or Zoom, such as, they may be harsh on the eyes for 13 hours a day, but what you have is technology that enables remote working. Imagine if this had happened in the 90s. You would have not seen the maintenance of productivity, in fact, even higher levels of productivity in many cases from remote working. And so what you have here, I think, is people have learned that they can be effective remotely. They do want choice. They do have technology that enables them. And many people are thinking a bit about what does their life need to look like? And that's a massive shift, I think, for American workers. And the challenge we're finding now, and you see it in some of the headlines, is we're having difficulty attracting and retaining workers. I think that will only increase, particularly those among perhaps white collar or knowledge workers who have this as an option. Many people do not. And so we need to be thoughtful about what does a hybrid workplace look like? How do we be fair and equitable? How do we communicate to some workers that they don't have the luxury or the option to work remotely? And how do we make that fair and equitable? The companies that can figure that out, Steve, are the ones that are going to have a better shot at attracting and retaining talent in a way that others will struggle. And there is a coming war for talent.
Right. We're talking with Rebecca Ray, the Human Capital Center leader at the Conference Board and an expert in all things pandemic. Rebecca, this whole everything that we're talking about, communication, all of the folks that we've talked about in leadership roles in companies tell us they really care and they're really concerned about worker well-being. They're not doing a perfect job of communicating that, and that's part of what we've learned through the work. But in this period of time, what are you seeing and what are you recommending to your members about what they can do to support their workers' well-being?
Sure. I think without question, there's been an impact, and the first might come to mind in terms of physical well-being. You can't necessarily get to the gym, or you might be sitting more and not out walking about, or have the option to do that given where and how some folks live. But what we found in our most recent April survey was that 60% of U.S. workers said that their mental, psychological well-being was at the top of their list of well-being concerns. And I think some of the things that you've mentioned previously about, Zoom fatigue and the sometimes asking people to deliver business results against a backdrop of sometimes some very, very challenging personal circumstances, that has taken its toll. So in the HR leaders who responded to the survey and those with whom, I talk, reinforce this. But what the leaders told us in the survey is that they saw a 76% increase in the number of employees who identified as burned out since the beginning of the pandemic, and a 72% increase in the number of employees who sought mental health and 67% increase in the usage of employee assistance programs. So that tells you there's a huge uptick. One of the things we saw in the survey is that many of the programs or support elements that companies had put in place, like teledoc services or EAP programs, which are all terrific, but we saw that employees did not take advantage of them to the extent that I'm sure most companies would have wanted. In fact, we saw a drop even among online EAP programs among millennials, which is the generation you would have thought would perhaps have taken most advantage of this. So I think two things. I think companies, to your point, Steve, need to do a very good job of reaching out to workers and asking them what they would find to be of benefit. And then secondly, putting those things in place and communicating it to employees so that they know to take advantage of it. It doesn't really matter if it's there and they don't know about it and they can't access it.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because pre-pandemic, I think most of your research said that the generation that felt most comfortable with remote work and wanted to be out of the office, it was the millennial generation, and the generation that felt least comfortable with it was sort of the baby boom generation. Once we were in the pandemic, it was almost flipped. And your points about, you said 60% of millennials have concerns. I think the majority of young people, I think the way to think about this, the majority of young workers are struggling here, with being out of the office, away from their social situations, whereas it seems like the older workers are just fine with all of this. Was that a surprise to you?
It was and it wasn't. I think I was surprised at the level. The percentages were so high. But to your point, millennials have more of a social interaction at the workplace than do other generations. And that's understandable given this is the time in your life when you perhaps, haven't yet formed a family, or you have a lot of reasons to make many of your colleagues your sort of inner circle of friends. And when you take that away, you are impacting someone on both levels, both a work level and on a social and personal level. So I think that's not that surprising given who they are. I tell you what was interesting to me is that for many people who worked remotely, particularly for people with disabilities, this has been a very leveling experience so that everyone was using technology. Everyone was being remote. And please understand, some never closed, and I understand that too. But for those who were working remotely, this has leveled the playing field and made some of the disparities less obvious. And we can talk when there's more time sometime about the intrusion into personal lives that sometimes has an impact on different socioeconomic groups or people who may not have the luxury of a dedicated space in which to work remotely, and a variety of other factors. But it has been fascinating. I'm sure it'll be the subject of someone's dissertation in the not too far future. But it's been an interesting change and culture shift for working adults.
Yeah, really, really good points. We're going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back with Rebecca Ray and get her thoughts on an issue that I'm interested in, developing the next generation of leaders.
Interested in this content? You can find this and much more at our Conference Board website, www.conference-board.org. Or, even better, contact our membership team and your company can enjoy the benefits of our in-depth research around the economy, environmental, social, and governance issues, public policy, marketing and communications, and human capital. As a member of the Conference Board, you will be able to have full access to all of our cutting-edge research, leading indicators, benchmarking, and data services, in addition to webcasts and podcasts such as the one you are enjoying now.
Hello and welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by our very own Rebecca Ray. Dr. Ray is the leader of our Human Capital Center and an expert in workplace and workforce. We've been talking about the reopening of the workplace and worker well-being. I want to now talk and flip to the leadership side, Rebecca. If things are changing as much as we have seen, and if that change, at least, partially, is going to be permanent, it means that leadership needs to change too. What are you seeing, and, what are your thoughts on how leaders can change?
Steve, I think the best leaders consistently do things, and they have for millennia. They're able to articulate a vision. They can create a plan to accomplish that vision. They build teams. They develop and engage employees. They deliver business results. In a perfect world, they're inspiring and engaging. And that has been sort of the core of leadership for a very long time. I think that none of that goes away, but I think we now expect even more from our leaders. This past year, we've asked them to listen, to be authentic, to be empathetic, to be vulnerable, to be accessible, to express genuine concern for the challenges, many of them very significant for the employees. And day after day after day has been an exhausting exercise in this for leaders. And I think companies need to do a better job in supporting certainly all leaders, but particularly those in the middle management or first rank supervisory level, because they are handling the brunt of worker challenges and worker exhaustion.
Yeah, and in your research and in some of your commentary, you've said that leaders need to be empathetic. What the heck does empathetic mean?
Sure. I think at its core, empathy is the capacity to understand or feel what another person's experiencing from their frame of reference, which of course may not be your own. And it's the capacity then to place yourself in another's position. I think a lot of that boils down also to self-awareness. It's difficult to lead others if you don't understand who you are as a leader and as a person. And what a great developmental opportunity this has been for leaders this past year and a half. For them to practice some of the core principles, to put people before problems, to deal with people's feelings before we get to the facts of a situation that you're looking to improve, to be there for other people, to have one more Zoom call at the end of an exhausting day because somebody's struggling.
Yeah, and to check in with them. I mean, being an empathetic leader is not just about, oh yeah, I understand their position, but it's about then taking action and doing something about it. And it's about having flexibility, and it's about just changing the requirements of work in order to meet the changing needs of the employee. And I think that's beyond just understand what they're feeling. And I think that's been your point in a lot of your research.
Yeah, Steve, I couldn't say that better. It is about finding out, what does someone need, and how do you balance that with the work that needs to get done, or the business results you need to deliver. And if you can figure out a way to help someone come along, or to have the flexibility or the breathing space or the time off or just the support to get through something and still keep that team intact and deliver, that's a highly valuable skill as a leader. And it's not going to get any easier to do, and it's not going to stop being front and center. The pace with which we are in the midst of massive change is only going to accelerate, as will the advent of technology. And, by the way, if we don't help our leaders develop these skills of resiliency and empathy and caring, and if we don't develop our people to be able to be resilient, they're not going to be ready for the next time this comes, and it will. There's always something else.
The old mantra from leaders is, well, if employees would just adapt, and it's really kind of reversed now. It's leaders need to adapt to the needs, and so that it all kind of works together, I think. And it's really a different view. You mentioned at the start of our conversation that the pandemic and everything that's happened in the past year, but also the social issues, which has been, to some ways, you don't know if it's causal. The pandemic caused the social issues, vice versa, or whether it just made society more brittle. But clearly, you cannot think about a workforce today without thinking about the social change issues. This last year has been unprecedented. How should leaders respond? How should leaders take into account the social aspects of their employees' needs?
Steve, I think an organization's need to respond to social change issues is not going to change anytime soon. I think it will only become more and more of a pressure to do so. So when we talk about responding to social change issues, we're really talking about the use of an organization's leadership or brand or resources to respond either internally or perhaps also externally to cultural norms and that are changing. And so a lot of organizations are judged on the quality of their relationships with a variety of stakeholders, right? Customers and employees and owners and communities. And I realize that I'm talking to the guy who wrote the book on sustainable capitalism, but they're expected to play a role in social change conversations. And these higher expectations come from a variety of sources. But largely in our studies, we looked at employees. And when we first looked at this issue in 2019, 98% of employees said that they felt their companies should respond at least some of the time. When we repeated it at the end of 2020, given all that had been going on in the United States, it was 99%. So really, there's not much more to go. It's virtually all employees that responded to our survey talked about the fact that these organizations, whom they have a higher level of trust in than many other institutions, they wanted these organizations to respond. And other stakeholders are going to do the same thing. Communities, customers, suppliers, they're going to force companies to take a stand. And the option to not respond is rapidly disappearing, but it is not without a great deal of risk, Steve.
Yeah, and I think, that's the point. I think, CEOs and business leaders need to be careful because, with all these stakeholders, you've got certain people who, lean one way, certain people that lean another way. And, they just have to thread that needle, and it's difficult. Rebecca, you've been an expert in human capital your whole career. I mean, and we have a human capital center that you lead. But this whole subject area of human capital now has gone beyond the personnel department, in quotes, the old-fashioned way to think about things. And you're hearing it now from every CEO. You're hearing about it in boardrooms. How is human capital management expanding, beyond the human resources group and becoming the purview of boards and all C-suite members?
Well, to your point, Steve, it's always been important, but I think it's going to be front and center. And part of that is there's a concern around culture, there's concern around succession, which there's always been, but also the impact of demands in the DEI space, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's becoming more and more of a focus for corporate boards. And especially as you watch this shift from shareholder to stakeholder, there's going to be increasingly pressure on boards to articulate how effective their human capital management truly is in terms of, how do they care for employees? How do they interact with communities? What's their commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion? What's the quality of their leadership? How engaged is their culture? And are they developing agile and resilient workers? So I think that pressure will come. And of course, the SEC disclosure ruling that came out last year was not terribly detailed or prescriptive. And it really did ask companies, it gave them a lot of latitude to kind of figure out what was material for them in terms of what they disclose and how they want to measure it. But it's still a significant change. And I think it's only going to become more and more prescriptive as it is in other parts of the world, particularly Europe, where they've taken the lead on much of this. And I think there are several things that boards need to do for effective oversight. They really should take enough time and attention to evaluate the company's human capital capacities, capabilities, needs, performance. What's their strategy, which I hope is intricately linked to the broader business strategy. A human capital strategy shouldn't sit over there by itself in the corner. And I think companies need to clarify and codify the roles of the board and its different committees. There's no real right answer to where this needs to sit in terms of a committee, but it does need to be coordinated. I mean, for example, DEI could be a part of all the committees. They need to think about what qualitative and quantitative measures of human capital management they want. And they need to have expertise on the board. Now, whether that's a sitting board member or they have frequent access to someone who is a human capital management expert, but I do think that they need to be able to understand it fully, to understand the value and the impact of a culture, and particularly about having a quality leadership core, because at the end of the day, you've got to have leaders who can effectively move these teams through what are going to be a couple of decades of really turbulent times.
Yeah, and I don't hear you saying it's the role of the board to direct human capital management, but it's really the oversight. It's from a strategic standpoint. The human capital is the most important resource that companies have. I think of it, Rebecca, and I don't know if this makes any sense to you, but I think of it similarly to the way we thought about risk several years ago. And, it started out that maybe the audit committee owned risk. And then, we began to break it down, do heat maps, and then assign what element of risk belonged to each of the board committees and the board itself. It feels to me like what you're saying is similar with human capital management, that same exercise needs to be done, and the provisions of oversight or the pieces of the oversight from each committee and the board need to be added to the charters. Is that a reasonable interpretation of where we are?
I think that's spot on. Remember the days when they would do a risk analysis and people weren't part of the conversation? It was all around what happens if our systems go down and what's our secondary site. And not a lot of, I think, thoughtfulness sometimes around how large your largest asset is going to be a factor in your, disaster recovery plans, for example. So I think that's right. I think it needs to be woven into the fabric of the annual board or committee self-evaluation process. And I think having access to experts is going to go a long way toward helping people understand how critically important it is for brand reputation, the ability to attract and retain top talent, and the ability to have the kinds of innovation and business progress that is going to be a differentiator in the marketplace. And that all boils down to human capital.
Yeah, great points, Rebecca. Rebecca, thanks so much for joining us today. We've been talking to Dr. Rebecca Ray, the leader of the Conference Board's Human Capital Center. And every few weeks, I'll be joined by a different leader from our centers or our CEO experts, both in the U.S. and around the world, to provide insights on the biggest issues keeping executives up at night. We'll cover the leading topics in public policy, environmental, social, and governance, marketing, communications, the economy, and human capital. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast, C-Suite Perspectives, and that you'll listen and share this with your colleagues as your business tackles the challenges brought about by these fast-paced and changing times. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You've been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast series from the Conference Board that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead to the nation's business leaders. Find this podcast and others from the Conference Board wherever you find your podcasts.